Roxy was frightened as the holy dragon approached and attacked her. Suddenly, Fate, disguised, arrived and used his shield to protect Roxy from the assault. The attack damaged Fate's mask. However, he managed to counterattack the holy dragon. Fate was impressed that Fate was able to activate the shield's special ability. Roxy realized that the person in front of her was Fate. Fate turned around and smiled at Roxy. However, Roxy was shocked by Fate's red eyes. Fate told Roxy to step back. He intended to engage the holy dragon to buy some time. He also apologized to Roxy for deceiving her. Then, he ran off, leaving Roxy behind. Roxy was concerned watching Fate go. She felt sad seeing him leave. Fate reached the holy dragon and was surprised to see it had regenerated. He noticed Northern standing atop the holy dragon's head. Northern held Freed and intended to attack. He sheathed Freed. Then, he struck with the reversed Grand Cross technique. Fate's attack hit the holy dragon, immobilizing it. However, Northern used his pistol to shoot at Fate from above. Fate dodged the attack and then swung his sword at Northern. Northern blocked Fate's sword and was impressed that Fate had immobilized the holy dragon. Northern jumped and swung his sword at Fate. Fate parried Northern's strike. Then, they fiercely engaged in combat. However, Fate was overwhelmed by the assault. This was because he had forced himself into Zone E. Moreover, the technique he used to immobilize the holy dragon drained his energy. Northern powered up and pushed Fate back. Fate tried to attack Northern again. Northern evaded the strike. Fate continued to pursue Northern. Then, Northern realized that Fate couldn't stray too far while using the technique to immobilize the holy dragon. Panicking, Fate attempted another attack on Northern. Seizing the opportunity, Northern swung his sword, cutting off Fate's left hand. Fate fell in pain. Northern approached Fate and aimed his sword at his head. Suddenly, a sword pierced Northern's chest from behind. It turned out Fate used illusion magic to strike Northern from behind. Fate knew Northern would let his guard down once he believed he had won. Northern was confused as to why Fate sacrificed his left hand to do so. Fate spun the sword and then slashed Northern's chest. Suddenly, the gluttony ability activated, and Fate found himself in an empty room. A girl appeared and spoke to Fate. This girl was the one previously inside Haniel's core. Her name was Luna. Luna thanked Fate for killing her. She was pleased that Fate had done so. However, she apologized to him. Fate was puzzled by Luna's words. Suddenly, cracks appeared, and monsters emerged from them. Luna had been restraining these monsters. This also prevented the gluttony ability from going berserk. But now, Luna couldn't assist Fate anymore. She couldn't support him. According to Luna, Fate would lose himself if he tried to prey on the holy dragon. Suddenly, the cracks shattered again, causing Fate to fall, but a man caught Fate's hand. This man was the human embodiment of greed. Greed lifted Fate up. Fate was surprised to see Greed. Greed told Fate to leave immediately. But before that, Fate wanted to talk to Luna. He thanked Luna but couldn't let the holy dragon roam freely. He intended to defeat the holy dragon. A conscious Fate looked towards Greed. He was shocked to learn that Greed was once human. The technique restraining the holy dragon broke, and the holy dragon began rampaging. Exhausted, Fate strategized how to defeat it. He lifted Greed and hurled him at the holy dragon. Greed hit the holy dragon's neck, causing an explosion. Fate jumped and used the fighter's technique, Crushing Strike. He punched the holy dragon's neck, creating a similar explosion. Greed was thrown, and Fate caught him. Greed was annoyed that Fate had tossed him. Then, Fate used identification to examine the holy dragon. It turned out that Fate, while in Zone E, had attributes surpassing a holy dragon. Fate jumped onto the holy dragon's shoulder and then cut off its wings. He also severed other parts of the holy dragon's body. Afterward, the holy dragon fell to the ground, but the holy dragon attacked with its laser beam again. Fate approached and charged through the laser beam. He used a power boost. Swinging his sword, he cleaved the laser beam. He also managed to split the holy dragon's body. His attack also devastated the ground, causing the holy dragon to fall in. The gluttony ability had activated, and blood trickled from Fate's mouth. He tried to restrain himself from going berserk. Then, he grabbed Greed and thrust it into the ground. Greed absorbed Fate's attributes. Greed told Fate to stop. However, after absorbing Fate's attributes, Greed transformed into a spear. Fate thought that by draining his attributes, he could minimize the damage while going berserk. Then, Fate collapsed after his attributes were absorbed. Only Fate and Greed remained in that place. However, soon after, Mine arrived carrying her axe. Fate asked Mine to end his life. Mine had warned Fate about the gluttony ability, but she was willing to grant Fate's request, intending to keep their promise. Mine raised her axe and swung it at Fate. Suddenly, Roxy appeared and charged at Fate, saving him from Mine's attack. Roxy was furious with Fate. Then she cried, expressing that she would never despise Fate, even if he had changed. She urged Fate not to attempt suicide. Fate looked at Roxy, puzzled, as the madness of gluttony had subsided. Roxy extended her hand, inviting Fate to return to Babylon immediately. Fate was relieved to see Roxy smiling at him. He felt comforted knowing that Roxy didn't hate him after learning the truth about him. Fate remembered when Roxy had saved him before. He wished for such moments to recur. Suddenly, Fate lost consciousness and collapsed. Mine left the two of them. Roxy cradled Fate, feeling a profound sense of happiness. All the residents of Babylon rejoiced upon hearing the news of the Holy Dragon's defeat. Mugen and Miria were also having a great time inside the bar. Fate woke up on a bed, realizing he was in an inn. He struggled to move as his left hand had been severed by Northern. Looking outside, he saw the rising sun. Suddenly, Eris entered his room. Fate was still suspicious of Eris, but then he saw Mine behind her. They conversed, and eventually, Eris handed over the now dirty Greed she had brought. Fate took and examined Greed. To retrieve Greed, Eris had ventured deep into Gallia's hinterlands. Greed believed he wouldn't have returned if not for Eris. According to her, a monster had taken Greed. This happened because Mine had forgotten to retrieve Greed when Fate fainted. Mine had been attending to Envy at that time, ensuring Envy wouldn't encounter someone like Northern again. Fate was still unaware of the connection between Envy and Northern. It turned out Northern was merely manipulated. Envy was the main entity controlling Northern. Fate was shocked and questioned Greed. Greed was unaware of Envy's mind control abilities, but believed Envy had indeed manipulated Northern. Fate pondered if Mine had destroyed Envy. However, the Great Sin weapon could not be destroyed, so Mine used her power to throw Envy to the edge of Gallia. Then, Eris stood up and spoke to Fate. She asked for his help because she had failed to turn Roxy into a crowned human. Before agreeing, Fate asked Eris not to harm Roxy again. Eris agreed to Fate's request. Eris sought Fate's assistance as Babylon would enter a new phase after defeating the Holy Dragon. She stated that Fate had no other choice but to help her. This was because Great Sin wielders like them couldn't avoid it. Fate knew little about being a possessor of the Great Sin ability. However, he believed there must be a reason he was born with the gluttony ability. He wanted to know that reason. Then, Eris told Fate to heal his hand first. Fate was surprised to hear Eris's words. He hadn't expected his hand could be healed. Eris urged Fate to leave before Roxy returned, due to the danger that arose when Roxy encountered gluttony. Shocked, Fate immediately agreed with Eris's words. In the middle of the city, Miria and Mugen were practicing sword play. Mugen noticed Miria was tired. He exerted more force, pushing Miria back. Miria tried to deceive Mugen by saying Lane was behind him. Mugen fell for it and looked behind. Seizing the moment, Miria leaped and swung her sword. Spotting Roxy emerging from her room, she left Mugen and approached Roxy. Roxy intended to leave, so she asked Miria to take her place. After Roxy departed, Miria became furious. She was upset because Roxy intended to go to Fate's location. Roxy walked past several merchants. She stopped and looked at a wine bottle belonging to one of the traders. Roxy entered Fate's room, carrying the purchased wine. However, she was surprised to find Fate wasn't in his room. She tried to find the missing Fate. Then, she noticed a letter on the table. Roxy read the letter. It contained an apology to her. Fate apologized for hiding the gluttony ability from Roxy, and one day he would meet Roxy again. Roxy felt saddened as she didn't know Fate had been struggling because of his power. Roxy remembered the first time she met Fate. She approached Fate, who was sitting alone by the fountain. She told him to leave the place immediately. However, Fate became frightened, thinking Roxy was going to hit him. He believed he had angered Roxy, who was a holy knight. Roxy unintentionally scared Fate with her shout. She realized that other holy knights had been misbehaving towards everyone. Then she lowered her head and apologized to Fate. She felt ashamed for being a holy knight. Suddenly, Fate's hungry stomach rumbled. Roxy smiled and told Fate to wait. She returned with some sandwiches. Fate took the sandwiches and began eating eagerly. Roxy told him to go home after eating. However, Fate had no home or family. After finishing his meal, he thanked Roxy. Roxy was worried, but Fate reassured her. Fate was happy to meet Roxy. He waved goodbye and left. Roxy listened to Fate's words, waving back. Now, thanks to Fate, Roxy could proudly be a holy knight. She hoped to meet Fate again. Memel and Raphael were discussing Mukuro. They were surprised to learn that Mukuro was Fate. Raphael finished his tea and then left to continue his research. Memel was puzzled by Raphael's ongoing study. Raphael entered a room and smiled. He thanked Fate for killing Hado. He laughed loudly upon seeing a bright red stone. Fate, Mine, and Eris went to an open field. Fate told Greed to take 40% of his attributes. He used the Twilight healing technique. Suddenly, Fate's left hand reappeared and slowly healed. Fate was pleased and looked towards Eris and Mine. Then, Eris and Mine left Fate. The three of them would meet again in the capital. Roxy led the soldiers back after successfully defeating the Holy Dragon. Meanwhile, Fate went on an adventure with Greed. Fate was surprised when Greed asked him to fix himself. He asked Fate to use a carbuncle sharpening stone. However, Fate didn't have the money to buy the stone. So he and Greed decided to hunt to earn the money.